We have a reading this morning. It was not listed in your order of service. It is the Spanish Requerimiento of 1513. Requerimiento means requirement, and when Spaniards arrived on coasts or inland areas in the Americas ready to take over those lands and peoples who had inhabited them since time immemorial, they read this document aloud. I have shortened it a tiny bit, but it's still longer than most of our readings. The language is archaic, but if you let it kind of flow over you, I think you'll get the gist of it. And if not, well, imagine being one of the original hearers of this document. It was read to them by the Spaniards in Latin or Castilian with no interpreters. And it is by turns ridiculous and horrifying. Also, some parts of the reading and the sermon today might be pretty upsetting to hear. So if you need to step out, that is okay. And I invite you to do what you need to do to take care. So here is the requerimiento. On behalf of the king, Don Fernando, and of Doña Juana I, his daughter, Queen of Castile and Leon, subduers of the barbarous nations, we, their servants, notify and make known to you that the Lord our God, living and eternal, created the heaven and the earth, and one man and one woman, of whom you and we, all the men of the world at the time, were and are descendants, and all those who came after and before us. That is the first sentence. But on account of the multitude which has sprung from this man and woman in the 5,000 years since the world was created, it was necessary that some men should go one way and some another, that they should be divided into many kingdoms and provinces, for in one alone they could not be sustained. Of all these nations, God our Lord gave charge to one man called St. Peter, that he should be Lord and superior of all the men in the world, that all should obey him, and that he should be the head of the whole human race, and he gave him the world for his kingdom and jurisdiction. And he commanded him to place his seat in Rome as the spot most fitting to rule the world from, but he also permitted him to have his seat in any other part of the world, and to judge and govern all Christians, Moors, Jews, Gentiles, and all other sects. This man was called Pope. The men who lived in that time obeyed that St. Peter and took him for Lord, King, and Superior of the universe. So also they have regarded the others who after him have been elected to the pontificate. And so it has been continued even till now and will continue till the end of the world. One of these pontiffs, it says, who succeeded that St. Peter as Lord of the world, made donation of these isles and terra firme to the aforesaid king and queen and to their successors, our lords, with all that there are in these territories, as is contained in certain writings which passed upon the subject as aforesaid, which you can see if you wish. So, their highnesses are kings and lords of these islands and this terra firme, and some islands, and indeed almost all those to whom this has been notified, have received and served their highnesses as lords and kings in the way that subjects ought to do, with goodwill, without any resistance, immediately, without delay, when they were informed of the aforesaid facts. And also, they received and obeyed the priests, whom their highnesses sent to preach to them and to teach them our holy faith. And all these, of their own free will, without any reward or condition, have become Christians, and their highnesses have joyfully and benignantly received them, and you too are held and obliged to do the same. Wherefore, as best we can, we ask and require you that you consider what we have said to you, and that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and that you acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, and the high priest called Pope, and in his name the king and queen Doña Juana are lords in his place as superiors and lords and kings of these islands and this terra firme. If you do so, you will do well, and we in their name shall receive you in all love and charity, and shall leave you, your wives, and your children, and your lands free without servitude, that you may do with them and with yourselves freely that which you like and think best, and they shall not compel you to turn Christians unless you yourselves, when informed of the truth, should wish to be converted to our holy Catholic faith, as almost all the inhabitants of the rest of the islands have done. But if you do not do this, and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country, and shall make war against you in all the ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them, as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage we can, as to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not that of their highnesses, or ours, nor of these cavaliers who come with us. And that we have said this to you, and made this requisition, we request the notary here present to give us his testimony and writing, and we ask the rest who are present that they should be witnesses of this requisition. There ends the reading. This is one of those sermons where I'm going to tell you something that directly impacts your life. It has to do with where and how we live. And it's a huge thing that is invisible to most of us. But in order to make it visible today, we have to travel back in time first. Our first stop is the first century. Christianity was new, and it had a grassroots quality. In the first decades after Jesus' death, people gathered in house churches. They were extended family-sized groups who met for prayer and ritual and discussion. There was a lot of theological diversity from one group to the next. It seems Jesus' disciples had each heard and interpreted his teachings slightly differently, with different aspects standing out and filling in the gaps according to their own best guesses or their context. They went out and taught others, and those others did the same, so that they did not all agree on how best to apply his teachings all the time. But the spirit of the faith was one of solidarity with the underdog. Jesus had touched people who were considered untouchable. He healed, he blessed the poor, he fed people, he hung out with bad influences. He was not impressed with power or wealth. In fact, while some people believed that wealth was a sign of God's favor, Jesus said the opposite. He said it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. This subversive religion had started to spread rapidly through the Roman Empire, and this alarmed wealthy and powerful leaders. Many of those early Christians faced persecution, often extremely violent persecution. Our next stop in time is the year 325, 300 years after Jesus lived, and a titanic shift occurs. The emperor, Constantine, aligned himself with the most organized, visible strand of that new Christianity, giving it official sanction and protection. Constantine was a very practical military leader who recognized the advantage of marshaling such a rapidly growing movement. Even though he is said to have had an authentic Christian conversion experience, he also appears to have continued worshiping Apollo, the son of Zeus. A Christian emperor meant a Christian empire or state. Now that the state was Christian, the two began to get smushed together. State and church, church and state. What was good for the state was good for Christianity, which in the minds of Christians then was what God would want. God would want what is good for Christianity, therefore God would want what is good for the state: growth, wealth, power. The impact of this conflation, this marriage between Christianity and empire, is hard to overstate. It really changed everything. Jesus was nonviolent. If somebody slaps you, he said, turn to the other cheek. But that is not how an empire grows. An empire grows through force of conquest. And now the empire was conflated with Christianity. The growth of the empire was also the growth of the faith. This mindset spread across Europe. It led to the Crusades, holy war against Muslims in the Middle Ages, sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church. And then, in 1492, a Spaniard named Cristobal Colón, known here as Christopher Columbus, sailed across the ocean and learned of the existence of something that caught everyone in Europe by complete surprise: the Americas. In the Americas, we often say that he discovered America, but how do you discover something that has been inhabited for thousands of years by a great variety of peoples with their own rich histories, cultures, and societies, right? He could not discover it any more than I could discover your home and move into it with all my stuff, right? You already know about it. It's been there the whole time. But the land was a surprise to Europe, and not just a geographical surprise, but a theological surprise. There was so much more to God's 5,000-year-old creation than the church had realized. How should they make sense of this and their role in relation to it? The next year, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI answered that question with the Inter Caetera papal bull. Inter Caetera is the title. A papal bull is a public decree made by a pope. The name bull comes from the bulla, or seal, that goes on them to certify their authenticity. Pope Alexander's papal bull presented the church's viewpoint regarding Spain's role in these lands they had just learned of. And it read, "Among other works, well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest, that in our times especially, the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and everywhere increased and spread, that souls be cared for and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself." In other words, if you do it in the name of our religion, you are free to take over other people's lands. Addressing the King and Queen of Spain, a Catholic country, the Pope went on to, quote, "give, grant, and assign forever to you and your heirs all the aforesaid countries and islands, discovered and undiscovered, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages." He gave, granted, and assigned. A pope in Rome gave away countries and islands halfway around the world that were already inhabited. Now, how on earth did the Pope come to see himself as the possessor of those lands, able to give and assign them as he wished? Well, popes believed that they, the popes, were God's proxies on earth, an earth that all belonged to God. Therefore, it followed in the minds of popes, the earth all belonged to the Catholic Church. This is how Spain conceived of and created that requerimiento that you heard. In the 1500s, as the invaders barged into and across the Americas, they read it, as I said, in Latin or Castilian. Sometimes it was delivered from the deck of a ship to an empty beach, because I guess if people couldn't understand it anyway, they didn't really need to be present for it to be valid. All of which belies the real reason for it, which of course was self-justification for the Christian invaders, and it was never intended to prevent violence, obviously. Quite the opposite. Whatever those invaders discovered was, in their eyes, already theirs for the taking. That teaching is called the Doctrine of Discovery. It matters what you believe, right? This matters. And this is why I'm so emphatic about our principle of honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Because when religious people and other people think they know who has worth and who doesn't, who's fully human and who isn't, this is what happens. This Catholic doctrine was adopted by France and England as well, and when colonists in what we now call the United States declared their independence from England, the doctrine carried over in a secularized version. The Native American scholar Stephen Newcomb recalls when he was in college, he took a law class in which they studied the case Johnson v. McIntosh. In that case, in 1823, The U.S. Supreme Court explicitly said that when the U.S. declared independence, when the colonists declared independence, they inherited the land claims made by European countries on this land. The decision states, discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy either by purchase or by conquest. The court spoke of native people as infidels and heathens. Newcomb was struck by that religious language being invoked right there in the law, in a country that's supposed to separate church and state. He spent the next decade doing research, tracking down the roots of those claims, and it turned out to come straight from the Doctrine of Discovery. That's what was inherited. Unlike other racist rulings of the past, the Johnson v. McIntosh decision has never been overturned. And the Doctrine of Discovery is still invoked in our courts today. One of the ways it plays out is that U.S. law recognizes Native American tribes as sovereign peoples, but the federal government controls their land. And when it suits the government's interests, including commercial interests, to take over the land, they do so. Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the Doctrine of Discovery in a case in 2005. The doctrine was implied in a decision against a Native man in another case just last August. It comes up pretty regularly. And it's subtly invoked outside of the courts, too. Streets and towns named Canaan, for example, are a reference to the Bible and to the Christian settlers' belief that this land was given to them by God. When the U.S. is described as a city on a hill, that's the same code. Stephen Newcomb compares the Doctrine of Discovery to binary code, a pattern that's repeated over and over again to create a larger system. He calls it a domination code, a code for a domination of people. And even the earth and her resources is now used to the point of irreversible harm to grow the wealth and power of the state and its richest, most powerful members. We don't grow up hearing this history, most of us, because it threatens this country's very identity as a land of liberty founded by people seeking religious freedom, right? Instead of that, there was this doctrine and so many trails of tears. And there was the enslavement of African people, which stemmed from the same theology. The papal bull called Dum Diversas laid that out in 1452. And this stuff that sounds historical is still so active. It's not gone. Do you know that the 13th Amendment, which is said to have abolished slavery, didn't really abolish it? It left a loophole. It says slavery shall not exist in the U.S., quote, except as punishment for a crime. Right now, as many have pointed out, more black men are behind bars or under the watch of the criminal justice system than there were enslaved in 1850. Hard stuff. We need a national conversation about race and genocide that is on the level of the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. We need that national conversation because it's only when we begin to widely acknowledge these stories, only when we allow their full implications to register with us, only then can wellness come to this place. And that national conversation starts with local conversations, with people speaking about it in schools and history classes and law classes and in neighborhoods and especially in churches. The Catholic Church has never renounced the Doctrine of Discovery. But, of course, the doctrine's power extends far beyond Catholicism. I mentioned the Johnson v. McIntosh case. Well, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was a man named Joseph Story. And Joseph Story was also president of the American Unitarian Association. Unitarians, like other denominations, have been complicit and have at times actively participated in religious malpractice and in state violence. These can be scary truths to confront, right? especially if we're in a kind of win-lose, good-evil, all-or-nothing mindset. But I'm not in that kind of a mindset. I'm in a mindset of mutual flourishing, of responsibility and honesty and deep spiritual grounding and deep faith that love will lead the way if we are humble and brave. I invite you into that with me. So let us speak honestly about these things and all things. I want wholeness and well-being and peace for our children and for our children's children, all of them, inside the church and outside. We all want that. So it's a time for courage and honesty. And some good things are happening. Several large Christian denominations, including the Episcopal Church, the Mennonites, the United Church of Christ, and others, have now publicly renounced the doctrine of discovery. Our denomination did so in 2012 with a resolution passed at the General Assembly that repudiates the doctrine, quote, as a relic of colonialism, feudalism, and religious, cultural, and racial biases having no place in the modern-day treatment of indigenous peoples. It calls upon our denomination to, quote, review the historical theologies, policies, and programs of Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism to expose the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery and to eliminate any trace of its presence in the contemporary policies, programs, theologies, and structures of the church. The resolution also publicly calls on other religious bodies to reject the doctrine, and it calls upon the U.S. to implement the standards of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in law and policy without qualifications. In her book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz lifts up the UUA's resolution as a particularly powerful and excellent model. Those are her words. Which means we got off to a good start, and now we roll up our sleeves, right? Hundreds of clergy, including many UUs, have shown up at the Standing Rock to publicly repudiate the doctrine of discovery there, too, and to side with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in having a say over their sacred lands and water. This is what that is about, this thing I just described. And there's lots more happening. I'll post links in the text of this sermon, which will be available on the website. Sermons are usually available by the Monday afternoon afterward. And I always also include citations in my sermon text. I spent too many years in school, but it's good because it means you can look and see where my facts are coming from, and you can check them out for yourselves. So I want to close with two opportunities I'll lift up, besides the ones that I'll link to. Two opportunities for those who are ready to take a next step in dismantling racism, speaking truth, and being in right relationship. The first is a training called Promise to Protect that is coming to Albuquerque this month. It's going to be in Albuquerque on March 23rd and 24th. Promise to Protect is an indigenous-led movement, and its goal is to provide skills and resources to activists who are resisting proposed fossil fuel projects in their communities and, if called upon, are committed to taking peaceful action alongside indigenous people on the route of the Keystone XL pipeline. You can get some more information about how to sign up for that training at the Connections table in the foyer. And also at the Connections table, there is a sign-up sheet for a new round of book groups studying Robin DiAngelo's book called White Fragility. While anybody is welcome to sign up for those book groups, it's important to know that the groups are geared toward white people learning together about the things that white people specifically need to understand in order to dismantle racism. And that is the focus of DiAngelo's text. Over 60 people took part in those White Fragility book groups last fall, and what they reported back is that DiAngelo's book is just a really excellent foundation for any other work we may do around race and justice. And there's a lot of work to do, and we are together in the doing it, little lights, combining, and that's a good place to be. Let's sing. Our closing hymn is number 120.